This is apropos. Well, the warning comes as protesters take to the streets of the Venezuelan capital this week to denounce US military threats in the Caribbean. President Nicolas Maduro says his government has foiled a false flag operation by local terrorists to plant explosives at the American embassy in Caracas and exacerbate a worsening dispute with Washington over drug trafficking. It comes as Donald Trump calls off efforts to reach a diplomatic agreement, paving the way for a possible military escalation. Eliza Herbert has more.
A false flag, a plot intended to lay blame on another party, has been foiled at the US Embassy in Venezuela. President Nicolas Maduro said Monday his security forces had halted the attempt after being tipped off.
There were two sources. One was national and the other international. They were followed up on and both agreed on the possibility that a local extremist terrorist group had placed an explosive device at the US Embassy in Caracas.
In the televised interview, Maduro also said he had written to Pope Leo to help maintain peace in the South American country as tensions flare with the United States. A topic at heart for these Venezuelans who marched through the capital on Tuesday, protesting recent US military threats.
I'm here today because we want to tell the President of the United States that this is a country of peace, not war. And we've always been peaceful. And to tell Mr. Trump to take his ships and his few batteries that he has here, because this is not a drug trafficking country.
US President Donald Trump has been bragging about his deadly anti-drug operations off the Venezuelan coast.
We're so good at it that there are no boats. In fact, even fishing boats, nobody wants to go into the water anymore.
On Friday, his military targeted another suspected drug trafficking boat. It was the fourth strike in the region in recent weeks, the legality of which is in doubt, with the death toll believed to be over 20. The US has also been building up its vessels in the Caribbean Sea, and President Trump is reportedly weighing up whether to advance to a second military phase, one that could include attacks on sites in Venezuela.
Well, for more, we're joined now by Phil Gunson, Senior Consultant for the Andes region at the International Crisis Group. Phil, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. If you can, tell us what exactly is at the heart of this worsening dispute.
Well, it depends who you talk to, really. Some people believe that this supposed anti-drugs operation is really aimed at toppling the government of Nicolas Maduro. And certainly there have been plenty of indications out of Washington that they want to capture Maduro, who they say is a fugitive from justice, and take him to face trial in the United States. There are other objectives as well. I mean, certainly part of it is to do with drugs, but there is a big question mark, as your introduction indicated, over the extent to which, Nicolas Maduro and his government, the extent to which Venezuela is really a major player in the drugs that are entering the United States.
And the US and Venezuela, they severed ties as far back actually as 2019, but they had difficult relations long before then. How far have those ties deteriorated since then?
Well, it's been up and down. I mean, certainly during the first Trump administration, from 2019 onwards, Trump applied a maximum pressure policy, but he stopped well short of what he's doing right now. And then, of course, in the middle, you had the Biden administration, which sought to negotiate an end to the crisis with Nicolas Maduro, gave him some relief from the sanctions that the US has imposed in the last few years. That led to an election last year, which the opposition won, but unfortunately, Mr. Maduro refused to recognize the results. So since then, things have really gone from bad to worse.
And you point out, though, that there are internal divisions, it seems, on the US side, suggesting that Marco Rubio is perhaps leading the charge when it comes to regime change in Venezuela.
Well, this has been a long-standing ambition of Marco Rubio, who, of course, is a senator from South Florida, the son of Cuban immigrants, somebody who's very much focused on Latin America. And Venezuela is a key ally of Cuba, which is probably Marco Rubio's main target. But I think at the present, what Rubio has successfully done has been to draw together these different strands of U.S. policy towards Venezuela, which have been very disparate. The Trump administration this time around, Trump 2, if you like, began with a much more transactional approach, trying to seek a deal with Maduro on release of hostages, on accepting deported Venezuelan migrants from the U.S. And so there's been some toing and froing, but right now it seems that they're all focused on this major military operation in the South Caribbean.
And, if the Trump administration is hoping for regime change and, perhaps hoping to spark an internal rebellion, isn't there a risk that that might backfire? We can see there those crowds of protesters taking to the streets, to show their anger at this mounting US aggression as they see it in the Caribbean.
There are definitely some dangers. Maduro is an unpopular president. But there are millions of Venezuelans who continue to support him and are very fearful of what might happen if the US did intervene militarily. The other point to bear in mind is that Venezuela is really packed full of different kinds of armed groups, from Colombian guerrillas and ex-guerrillas to criminal gangs and so on. Lots of people with lots of guns who are very much committed to the status quo would look very unkindly on any change of government. And I think the problem really is that the stage is set, if things go wrong, for some kind of protracted, low-intensity conflict in Venezuela lasting, like a really long time.
Is there any real possibility, though, that the US might actually attempt a full-scale incursion? We have heard Donald Trump, ramp up that rhetoric, saying the US now considers itself to be in a non-international armed conflict. What exactly does he mean by that?
Yes, well, part of this is to do with domestic US politics. Of course, Trump is very much focused on deporting as many immigrants from the US as he possibly can. And one of the ways in which he wants to do that, accelerate the process, is to use something called the Alien Enemies Act, which is only really applied in wartime, to avoid the necessity for people going to court. In other words, you could deport people instantly without any due process. And of course, it's much easier to convince the courts that he can apply that act if he claims that there's an actual war going on. So it's not all to do with regime change in Venezuela.
And is Maduro himself, preparing for more extreme measures? He also seems to be ramping up the rhetoric as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, of course, the government here is saying that whatever happens, they will continue to resist. Nobody believes that the Venezuelan armed forces could very long resist the kind of force that the US currently has arrayed against them. But the government has said that, if they were overthrown, if there was a US intervention, then they would take to the hills, basically, and carry out guerrilla warfare for as long as it takes. And they're openly speaking about another Vietnam. How realistic that is another matter.
But you do say, though, that the Maduro government wants to negotiate and is prepared perhaps to make concessions. What might they look like?
Well, they're prepared to make concessions. I think even in terms of drugs, I mean, they've been making a great effort to present a picture in recent weeks of, cracking down on drug trafficking in Venezuela. They're prepared to make a deal on that. I'm sure they're prepared to make a deal on oil. Venezuela, of course, is a major oil producer, or at least it was. It has great, huge reserves of petroleum. On immigration as well. I think that the bottom line, though, is that there's been no offer from Maduro, and there's unlikely to be an offer, I think, in the near future, of actually leaving power. And Maduro is determined to stick it out, and the people around him seem equally determined. I think for the moment they believe that they can hold out, and that there's no need to basically to unconditionally surrender.
And you mentioned oil, Phil. How much influence does the oil lobby have here? It, of course, wants to see sanctions lifted.
Yes, the oil companies are frustrated at the fact that they can't, get their hands on this very large these very large reserves of, or not only oil but gas as well in Venezuela. So they would like to see an end to sanctions. They would obviously like to see some sort of political settlement that would allow a return to normality. And then, of course, you've got a lot of people who hold Venezuelan debt. Venezuela defaulted on its debt some years ago. A lot of people have been left holding essentially worthless paper for the time being. But if there's a settlement, then, of course, all of a sudden that debt could become worth much more because there could be some form of debt restructuring.
And let's imagine for a moment that Maduro is possibly potentially toppled. What happens then? Would that lead to chaos on the streets, or would that lead to a more democratic form of government? What do you think?
Well, there's a big question mark over that. If you talk to people close to the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who is in hiding, they will tell you that everything will be fine, that nobody will resist, that the only problem is Maduro and his immediate circle, and everybody else will fall into line. Other people, and in Crisis Group, we include ourselves in this group, we're very worried that if the government is removed without any form of prior negotiation and the armed forces are left out of the equation, there'll be nobody to keep order. And the problem here, as I say, is that there are plenty of groups who would react, I think, quite violently to a change of government. And if there's nobody, the US isn't going to come, with three divisions and try to keep order in Venezuela. Trump doesn't want to get sucked into another endless war. So who's going to keep order? I think that's a question that really needs answering.
And what do you think is actually going to happen then, Phil? You say as well that there is another big question. What would it take for the US to actually withdraw from where it is right now?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because they kind of have to reach a point where they can say mission accomplished and the fleet steams away. They can't keep it there forever. It's a very expensive operation, and the longer they go on without really achieving anything, the more the pressure is on them to show that something tangible has come out of this. And I think that's probably one of the dangers, in the sense that to the extent that so far they haven't really achieved very much, there's a more likelihood that we'll see attempts to blow things up on land. Probably, I mean, nobody, I don't think, is really thinking in terms of an actual US invasion. Putting ground troops in, it doesn't seem to be on the cards, at least at the moment. But I think we might well see some explosions. Whether that would convince Maduro, I tend to think it wouldn't, and unless, of course, the US is determined to go all out and attack Caracas, attack the military and civilian headquarters here, and perhaps even go for targeted assassinations. But it remains to be seen. Really, Trump has the last word, and he's rather unpredictable.
A lot of questions remain, as you say, Phil. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much, though, for being with us on the programme. That's Phil Gunson, Senior Consultant for the Andes region at the International Crisis Group. Thank you.